Good evening, and welcome to Host with Mary Louise Kelly and our very own Nicole Darden Creston. I am Erica Pulley-Hayes, President and CEO of your local public radio stations, WMFE and WMFE. Tonight, we're bringing our audience a little closer by sharing an intimate conversation between our local and national hosts of NPR's award-winning afternoon news magazine, All Things Considered. Each afternoon, these women take us through the biggest stories of the day and connect us with the arts, music, and entertainment. This is so fitting for Nicole. If you've been listening to us for a while, you know her. She's been on air here since 2010. She has covered everything from local arts to national elections, from extraordinary hurricanes to historic space flights, from the people and procedures of Florida's justice system to the changing face of the state's economy. When local issues have received national attention, or international attention even, Nicole has reported for TV news outlets such as CNN, Headline News, ABC, Fox News Channel, and BBC News 24. When she's not reporting or hosting for WMFE, Nicole can often be found performing with one of Central Florida's many theater companies or taking in local arts, culture, and music. Mary Louise Kelly spent a decade as national security correspondent for NPR News, and she's kept that focus in her role as anchor. She has taken All Things Considered to Russia, North Korea, and beyond, including live coverage from Helsinki for the infamous Trump-Putin summit. She first launched NPR's Intelligence Beat in 2004, and after one particularly tough trip to Baghdad, she wrote an essay about it for Newsweek and decided to try trading the spy beat for spy fiction. Her debut espionage novel, Anonymous Sources, was published by Simon & Schuster in 2013. It's a tale of journalists, spies, and Pakistan's nuclear security. Her second novel, The Bullet, followed in 2015. This past year has been ripe for news, as I can attest that there has been no shortage of stories to cover. Important stories. I'm glad that I can count on these women to help me make sense of it all by bringing me the facts every weekday afternoon at 4. I hope they help you make sense of it all too. And I also hope that tonight's program enlightens, educates, and inspires you to remain informed and engaged to ensure a strong local community and America's democracy. Enjoy the program.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Erica. Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Darden Creston here at the WMFE studio in Orlando, and I'm joined by NPR's Mary Louise Kelly. Hello, Mary Louise.
Good evening. Nice to see you, Nicole. Nice to be with everybody.
Nice to see you, too. First things first, when I'm not on the air, I prefer that folks call me Nikki as opposed to Nicole. What do you prefer? What are you most comfortable being called?
I'm so glad you asked, because usually it's me correcting people on air. I go by Mary Louise. I grew up in Georgia, and good double-barreled Southern girl name, so I go by Mary Louise. That's perfect.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let's start with ATC. Do you have a role in choosing All Things Considered stories for the day? How does that work?
Oh yeah, a big role. And that's one of the fun parts of the job. Although it is such a, well, you can hear the Bernedoodle behind me barking. I was going to say such a huge team effort, and it's now expanded to include home, which is where we've been broadcasting from since March, April of last year, so a year. The process, here's the 60-second version. We still hold a 9:30 meeting every day. This dates from the quaint old times of, like 6 years ago, when you could, at 9:30 in the morning, brainstorm a bunch of stories and think there would be any possibility that that list of stories might survive the news cycle between then and 4 o'clock. That is gone. But still do it, because if you don't get together and brainstorm, when else are you going to dream big? When else are you going to get to bounce ideas off somebody? If you have ideas for a really exciting chase, we call it, somebody who you want to hear on air that night. You got to put those balls in motion early. So we still do a meeting, and sometimes the ideas survive the day and sometimes they don't, or they morph into a different form. But that is, it depends, but say 25 people right now on Zoom, usually in person in a conference room at NPR headquarters, and you throw out ideas. And the meeting can be absolutely terrifying, even to the host of ATC. You throw out an idea and you see everyone go,
I have been there.
But it's great because everyone from the hosts and the executive producer to the interns are pitching ideas. And half the time you're interested in something, but you're not quite sure what you want to do about it. And that's the value of being able to kick it around with colleagues, because someone will say, oh, you know who would be really interesting to talk to on that? And then somebody on your other side is texting that person because they happen to have their, contact deets, or they were just following them on Twitter. And so you're, lining people up. The meeting is a working meeting in every sense. People are getting booked and feelers are going out to the desks about where we hope reporters might be deployed during the day. So that's the kind of the daily grind of what's going to be on air at 4:00 tonight. There are days when we rip it up and throw it out the window, many days. And then there, the bigger, longer term projects where you're trying to think in an ambitious way, so that we're not just reacting to the onslaught of news, but trying to do original enterprise things. And that's obviously some of the most satisfying work. As Erica mentioned in her kind introduction, I came to anchoring from covering foreign policy and national security. And that is, of the gazillion stories that we considering all the things every day, that is still my sweet spot. And so I'm always thinking, how do I get a visa back to Iran or back to Russia? Or how do we get that first interview? I was emailing and on the phone this week to CIA headquarters because we have a new CIA director and he has given no interviews yet. And shouldn't he give his first to NPR? I think so. Let's make the case. So those are the type balls you're always putting in motion, trying to figure out kind of how could we bring those voices that aren't just going to pop up on our air, but you're working long term for future shows.
Some of that process sounds very familiar. Being cool enough to have the CIA director possibly return my call, not familiar.
I should clarify, he did not take my call this time. This was his press team, but the gateway to the CIA director.
Yes, work your way through. You mentioned being national security correspondent. And in 2013, you were reporting from around the globe when a particularly difficult moment you experienced while you were in Baghdad prompted you to leave that job and concentrate on your family for a while. What prompted you to come back as a host?
I didn't plan to come back as a host. I had covered the national security beat and foreign policy for years, and I loved it and had worked really hard to get kind of half decent at it and have sources and have people who could get my call routed to various people at the CIA and other agencies. And it's a struggle, as all of us know, trying to balance family, particularly with that kind of unpredictable schedule with a ton of unpredictable travel. And I had 2 little kids, and I hit a wall one day in Baghdad, and on the plane back to Andrews Air Force Base, thought, I got to figure out a change here. This is not working for me or my family. And so I took years, and started writing books. And I loved it. And the books were incredibly fun to write. And I had a way more family-friendly schedule. I didn't have to pack body armor when I traveled. Nobody called me on deadline in the middle of the night. Book deadlines are terrifying, but they're measured in months and years, not seconds and minutes, the way NPR deadlines are. But I kept waiting to stop missing it, to stop missing the news. And I didn't. The day my first book published was the day, let me get this right, that Edward Snowden flew into Moscow to sanctuary, some kind of immunity from prosecution. And there he remains. And it was this huge story. And I just remember I'm supposed to be delivering this book talk at Politics and Prose, this lovely bookstore in DC, about my first novel. Like, that's the biggest, coolest feeling ever. And I couldn't stop checking my phone for updates on what's happening with Snowden. And I need to get on that plane and figure out what's happening in Moscow. And that impulse did not go away. Eventually in 2015, I thought, okay, I think this is not going to go away. If every time a big story on my old beat breaks, I want in, I should probably go back in. And I was lucky and called NPR and said, this is what I want to do. This is what I can bring. And they hired me back to cover national security. I started in January of 2016. I thought it was going to be a really calm year on the national security beat because it was a presidential election, and traditionally foreign policy is not, barring some war or huge crisis, is not first and foremost in primaries and debates. Needless to say, 2016 was not a quiet year on the national security front. And I found myself in Moscow, not covering Snowden, but covering election interference. I was there in Moscow the day that the story broke that the DNC had been hacked. And
holy cow.
and we kind of went from there. And I had always loved filling in as a host and as an anchor, and did more and more and more of it. And again, it's one of those, you're in the right place at the right time. I was really ready to give it a try when Robert Siegel, who had mentored me and who I had edited when I first came to ATC, and who I revered and still do, when he announced, you know what, I think this is the right moment for me to exit. So they were looking for a host, and it came together.
Excellent. How's it different for you? Obviously, there's the globe-trotting element, but besides that, how is hosting different than field reporting for you?
So the globe-trotting field reporting element is actually very similar. And this is a lovely thing that I love about hosting at NPR, is that they are deeply committed to the host being in the field. And in my case, with my interest in international news, have been very supportive of me being out in the field. This last year has obviously been an aberration in a million ways that we could get into. And I was supposed to be leaving for Russia a year ago to go back, and hasn't happened, but we'll get there. But I have been in the field a lot and anchored the show from Iran and Russia and London and Helsinki and all over, and that's been great. The primary differences are two. One is the terror, which I'm slowly getting a little less terrified about, but I retain a healthy level of terror of having to consider all the things every day, which it goes without saying, I'm not an expert in all of those things. Covering the national security beat, there's a million things I don't know, and I'm learning every day, but I have some, having covered it for years, if Bibi Netanyahu does something about settler policy in the West Bank, I have some groundwork for reporting on that. I've been there. I know that story. If there's a development on the Iranian nuclear deal, I have a baseline of knowledge. If you threw me into a live interview about the NFL, my baseline is like under the floor.
I'm with you on that.
And those are some of the most terrifying interviews I do. Is you're live and there's no safety net, and all you can do is your best and ask the questions that a reasonable, if utterly uninformed person about this might ask, and hope that there's other reasonable, uninformed people out there listening and that they'll cut you a little bit of a break. That feeds into the second big difference, which is just as a reporter, you're working on a team, you're working at a network, but it's solitary. You're by yourself in Russia. For better or worse. That can be lovely. You're making all the decisions. You're covering the story as you think it should be covered. You're checking in with your editor. You have producers checking in a little bit, but you're on your own, figuring out how you want to navigate what can be a very big beat. As a host at ATC, there are like 4,000 people involved when I sneeze. It's a hugely collaborative effort with producers and engineers and editors interns and bookers, all the number of people involved on every interview, including, I don't know, a live interview with Mara Liasson from the White House, like something straightforward between two people who do this every day. It's her editor's involved, and she's involved, and the operations desk is involved, and my producer's involved, and the studio director's involved, and again, that has its very frustrating qualities where you're like, can I just do this? Do we really need to have another conference call to discuss this? Can we just do it? But on balance, it's a really lovely thing, the collaboration, and it's a cliche, but it's true. You get a bunch of smart people together, you're going to come up with better work than one smart person working on something. And people, oh man, save me from myself every day. And that's a wonderful thing about hosting.
How do you interview the people that you interview, for instance, world leaders, without feeling intimidated?
There is a moment, if you're interviewing somebody, and it's funny, it's world leaders. I get the little frisson of nervousness before, like a Matt Damon interview or a Jane Fonda interview or something like that, where it's just suddenly the mic goes hot and you hear this voice and you're like, oh my God, that's Jane Fonda, and she's taking my questions. Like, forget the president of Afghanistan, that's Jane Fonda. So
that's awesome.
I do get nervous, less so, and I think it comes with experience. It comes with getting a little bit older, frankly. I turned 50 last week, and you're just at a different point in life in terms of giving a rip. Like 5. I don't mean giving a rip in terms of the excellence of the interview and prepping for it and all of the rest, but I mean in terms of like, do I really care what this guy thinks of me? Not really. I just want to go in and do my best work, and I know if I've done the prep that I've done my best, and it's not going to be perfect, and I'm going to come out and kick myself every time thinking afterward of the interview that question I really wish I'd followed up with. That is eternal and I think perpetual to anybody who interviews me for a living. The main thing, and I remember feeling this very strongly in one of the most prominent interviews I did when I was kind of trying out for ATC host, which was when the Me Too scandal was erupting nationally and then erupted in the NPR newsroom, and our chief news editor, Micah Reskis, was forced to resign, and it was big national breaking news. And yes, I interviewed our CEO, then CEO Jarl Mohn, on air about it. And that's a strange interview to do, to grill your boss on air about your other boss who has just been forced out for allegedly sexually harassing your colleagues. And we had very little time to prep. It came to very quickly. And you go in, and I think what gives me courage is knowing it's a privilege for me to get to ask the questions, but he's not taking my questions. He doesn't care about what Mary Louise Kelly wants to know. He's taking the questions of everyone in the newsroom. He's taking the questions of every woman in any office where a male boss has behaved inappropriately, and she doesn't have the chance to grill him and hold him to account. So it's my mouth opening, but it's your questions that are coming out. And so when somebody doesn't answer a question or when they dodge it, that is what makes me think, okay, well, I got to re-ask that. I'm going to ask it again because all of these women behind me are waiting for an answer here. And I feel that in the big controversial interviews I do, the people standing behind me who deserve an answer, who have trusted me to ask those questions. I
love that. You have been called a model of inquisitorial technique. That was written by an opinion writer in The Guardian right after you interviewed goodness gracious, I keep calling it. I keep saying
Secretary of State.
Yes, our former Secretary of State. Yeah, Mike Pompeo. You earned a 3-minute segment of well-deserved praise from at least one late night host after that, and I'm laughing because you handled it so well. But at the end of the day, it isn't funny because you shouldn't have had to. Do you still think about that? And if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what happened after the interview, you asked some valid questions and the questions were being dodged, and you, as you just said, you held his feet to the fire. You went to get the answer, which is what you do. Right. You were asking questions that all of us wanted to know. And then afterward, it seemed that he was a little upset.
Yeah, he was a little upset. I was amazed, actually, that interview blew up as widely as it did. And I think it wouldn't have, except for the coda that came afterward and that we reported on it. The context was, I had been asking for an interview with Pompeo for a while. It's my job as a host, as interested in foreign policy, to try to get the Secretary of State on air. Pompeo did, to his credit, a fair number of interviews for a public official who doesn't have to, but mostly with conservative news outlets or local news outlets that were, again, some of them were asking very good questions, but where he, I think, was assured that he was going to have a somewhat friendlier hearing. And I see my job as not going in to give him an unfriendly hearing or, try to have a confrontation in any way. It's when I was prepping for the interview, I knew I wanted to focus on Iran because I was just back from Iran, and seems like 1,000 years ago, but in January of last year, we almost went to war with Iran. And I
that does seem so long ago, but yes, I recall.
Just interviewed his counterpart, the Foreign Secretary of Iran, in Tehran, and so thought, what a great opportunity if you would give me an interview to answer some of the things that he said, that Javad Zarif said. And I suspect that's why the State Department said yes, because they want to talk about Iran. But we were allotted 10 minutes, and when I went and looked at recent transcripts with Pompeo, he had not been asked any of the, what seemed to me, burning relevant questions about Ukraine. And about what was happening at the State Department, considering that at the moment we sat down for that interview, we were in the middle of the first Senate impeachment trial of President Trump, a trial that focused around Ukraine. Pompeo had been on the infamous call with the president of Ukraine. And Ukraine was at the middle of possibly of impeaching the president of the United States and then possibly removing him from office. How could you not ask the Secretary of State about that? So I told his office the night before that I would, and we showed up and did the interview, and he was very, very angry to be asked about Ukraine. He didn't want to talk about it. We spent several minutes on it, and then one of his press aides wrapped the interview early. And then, he, one of his aides came and summoned me, just me. I was there with a producer and an editor and a digital writer and Michelle Kilman, our State Department correspondent, a whole team. They summoned just me back to his private living room on the 7th floor of the State Department. And he yelled at me for about the same amount of time as the interview. And I know the most famous segment of that was said, "Do you think Americans fucking care about Ukraine?" You couldn't even find it on a map. And I said, well, I could, but that's not the point. Do you want to, was there a particular question that you object to? Or, And he threw open the double doors of his study and called for aides to bring him an unmarked map. So when I say unmarked, not just no writing, no borders, nothing, just blobs, land masses. And said, point to Ukraine. And I pointed to Ukraine, and put the map away and yelled at me for a little while longer and said people will hear about this. And then dismissed me, and I went on my way and ran to the State Department booth where Michelle Kellerman often files from, and we filed immediately for Morning Edition. I did not, in that first Morning Edition interview, the tape was so good of what we did have on tape. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do about the coda. It was part of the interview. We'd never gone off the record. It was why I was at the State Department that day, was to interview him. And I figured if he wanted to keep talking, great. I also thought this speaks directly to the character of this person in a senior government official, and not just any person. It would have, I think, resonated less in a way if it had been the Defense Secretary or the Treasury Secretary. The Secretary of State's job is to promote American democratic, including the importance of a free press. And so to have that from him seemed newsworthy and like something our listeners needed to hear. So we reported it. We gave them a chance to comment on it before we did so. We told them we were going to report on it. They did not provide us comment, and the next morning he put out a statement calling me a liar, and things went from there. In a way, it was the most prominent interview I've done yet because of the way that it went, became global news. But it was just another interview. You go in, you do the prep, you know what you want to ask. In an interview like that, I don't go in with pages and pages of questions. I go in with 2, 3 that I really want to know the answer to, and I know he's not likely to answer, so you're prepared to follow up in 17 different ways, depending on which direction he goes. And you ask questions persistently but respectfully. That's the job, no matter what you're getting back. Yeah, it was an interesting moment to be called a liar by the Secretary of State, and then have the president call me out the next week. And
that's astonishing.
Extraordinary, yeah.
It speaks to how strange it's been to be a journalist over the past few years. We had to sort of struggle with how and whether to use the word lie. For instance, when someone in a position of national power made an assertion that was false and demonstrably false. And so NPR's standard became essentially, as I understand it, if you can prove the person knew that it was untrue and they said it, only then do you call it a lie. And that's a solid guideline, but I think the journey was, and still kind of is, pretty messy for all of us. And it still goes on how we tell both sides of a story, as journalism would impel us to do when one side is false, like the assertions that the presidential election was fixed are demonstrably false. So we've got sort of new journalistic terms like both sidesism and news siloing, and we have commentary shows laying claim to the word news, which is a personal pet peeve of mine.
And I'm with Nikki on that. You raised such a good point. Our policy on whether to use the word lie certainly evolved over the Trump presidency, as it should have, as our coverage did. Our policies on what words we used for all kinds of things evolved. And to me, just how we thought about, you're absolutely right. It used to be, we'd be covering some controversial issue and, the line producer would say, well, we've got a Republican on, let's get a Democrat on. And now, okay, both sides, we're fair, we're balanced. Well, is there a need to balance truth? If you have one person who is demonstrably telling the truth, and another person repeating what is demonstrably a lie, do you have an obligation to balance it out? I don't think so. And that's where we landed. But it got very tricky because at the same time, as we know, almost half the country voted for Donald Trump and bought the big lie in 2020. And I don't want to ignore those people, and I don't want them not to be listening to us. And I want to be engaged in thoughtful, smart conversation. And you can't do that unless you talk to them. So that's where it gets sticky for us. The conversations we had about, do we put a White House spokesman on air? Were intense every time. What value are we going to get? What will people learn from this? I'm happy to give somebody a hard time and grill them and, fact check them in real time. But what's the value of that? How are we advancing anyone's knowledge? On the other hand, do we never talk to? So, like the White House? He's the president. And so these were tricky questions. We're working right now on a big network-wide project, trying to figure out, it felt for a while there as though we were in this moment of real democratic crisis and peril. And as journalists, could we do a better job of bringing people inside those conversations? Because we're having really heated conversations about why we put the people on air who we choose to put on air and not. How much of that should we share? How much do we pull back the curtain so people can agree or disagree with where we land, but understand what's informing it, and that we're being so thoughtful about this, and we don't get it right every time, and it's evolving as we go, but we are really wrestling with it and continue to, absolutely.
Also, on the self-examination and the wrestling with issues going on in newsrooms, within the reckoning going on in our broader society, we've got that context as well. Whose stories we tell, whose perspective is represented, whose voices are amplified, and whether journalism's traditional definition of objectivity is actually analogous to non-biased, or whether it inadvertently enforces a status quo. And that's another thorny, complicated one. Do you think there's a balance to strike between traditional objectivity and incorporating a journalist's lived experience so the news is presented through the eyes of people who are directly impacted by it? For instance, we heard some Asian American journalists say, or read on Twitter, that their editors forbade them from covering stories about hate crimes against Asian Americans because the journalist is perceived by the editor to be too close to the topic personally.
Yeah, and the comparison that got made in our newsroom was, really? Does that mean women can't cover Me Too because we might be too close to it or have a personal experience? Because if you're going to rule women out from covering sexual harassment, you're never going to have another woman speaking about it ever again. Yeah, it's fascinating. This is my personal view. I'm not speaking for NPR. I have opinions. I'm a human being. I have thoughts and views on things. I think it's perfectly possible to have an opinion and try your damnedest not to be biased, to have my opinion, but be willing to defend to the death that you might have a really different opinion about something, and then that might be also valid of coverage.
It's foundational for us.
Yeah, another example that was controversial in our newsroom, and I know many others in these recent months, has been participation in the racial justice protests. It has been NPR's longstanding rule that our journalists do not engage in politics publicly. We don't go to a rally unless you're covering it. I don't walk around in a Biden or a Trump t-shirt. I don't have a yard sign. I don't contribute to campaigns. Some journalists take it farther and they don't vote. I vote, but I keep it private.
We're the same way here.
Yep. And that has been the standard of most mainstream newsrooms since forever. That's how we do it. Younger journalists, I'm not exclusively younger, but there is a generational component to this as well. We're speaking up and saying, seriously? You're going to tell me we don't support that Black Lives Matter? And if we think that Black Lives Matter, you're going to tell me I can't go walk, with this group of people holding up a sign saying it does? I don't want to use this. I'm trying to think. I mean, that I'm trying now to remember actually where NPR guidance on this landed. I can't remember. It came up with other things. One of my co-hosts who was asked to MC a gay pride parade and made the same argument and said, "You're telling me this is who I am. You're telling me I can't embrace my own identity, and if I can, why can't I, publicly support it?" These are tough things to wrestle with for newsrooms, because I absolutely agree with the staffers saying, of course we support this. As an organization, we say this on air. Why can't we show up at a rally? I also get that it gets tricky and thorny really, really fast when you are, again, it gets to the both siderism thing. I don't feel any need to give airtime to someone who says Black lives don't matter. But there is clear overlap between people who are attending those protests and political advocacy groups who do have viable, adversaries and people who disagree with them across the political spectrum on other issues. And I want to be able to fairly interview them too. So it's a challenge.
It is tough. We're still wrestling with it, and there doesn't seem to be a good solid answer, at least yet. I have a question that has come in from one of our viewers. What was Mary Louise's best interview, or most fun, or most uneasy? One that stood out for you?
We might have touched on uneasy between the phone interview and Mike Pompeo. I hope it doesn't get much more uneasy than those.
I really do too.
There have been so many that are fun, but here's one that will really stick with me from this year. And it speaks to the magic of radio and our community and why we do what we do. Very early, before we called it a pandemic, I guess before it was a pandemic, January of 2020, when we were starting to get dribs and drabs of something strange happening in Wuhan, China. And we weren't sure what it was, and China locked down, and so our China correspondent couldn't go tell us what it was. So we're trying to hear from somebody there. And one of my producers was geolocating on Twitter, trying to find anyone in Wuhan who was tweeting in English who we might be able to get on the phone. This is how we find a lot of interviews and breaking news situations is somebody posting social media in English from this place. Can we get them? Get them on air, get them now. In this case, he tracked down a guy named Piso Seke, who at that point had been locked down for, I can't remember, like 3 days in his apartment in Wuhan. And he's telling me what at the time sounded so utterly strange about masks and quarantine and lockdown. And he wasn't allowed to leave. And we had this lovely, just very human interview where I said, "Are you locked down alone or do you have family?" And he said, "No, I'm not married yet. I'm trying." And I said, "Well, I guess it's hard to meet somebody in these circumstances if you're never allowed to leave your apartment again." And he started laughing. And so it was just a fun human interview when at the time that felt so utterly foreign from us. And unbeknownst to either of us, of course, our stories were about to intersect and cross. And I interviewed him multiple times as January turned to February, turned to March, and this country shut down, including, an interview where I was at home locked down and he had just been released and had gone out and gotten his first pizza since January. So in some 80 something days, he was allowed out of lockdown.
Wow.
So excited and telling me about it was a Hawaiian pizza and how good the pineapple was, and how excited he was, and how he was ready to date again, and that I want to come to his wedding. And felt like I had a friend. It still feels like that. I'm in touch with him over Twitter. It felt like I had a friend thousands of miles away, living a very different life all the way around the world, but where you're connecting through the dark down the phone line to a human being who's having an experience that feels very different from yours, but is about to overlap. And the power of those interlocking conversations as both of our worlds turned upside down will stay with me. And it's something that I've clung to and tried to replicate in other conversations, because this is a really frustrating way to anchor a show. I'm at home. I don't get to leave. I don't get to be out in the field that much, which is what I love doing. And I kept thinking, what can we still bring to this? How can we still engage people when we're all cloistered and not together. And those moments of human connection are even more powerful in these times, and will really stick with me. And it was a lot of fun. And I hope he gets married so I can go to his wedding.
That's excellent. Have you discovered a pandemic hobby or a something that's helped you hold things together during this time?
Wine. Baking. No, it's very frustrating. My co-host Ari Shapiro would not mind my sharing. He has been a paragon of pandemic productivity and is growing all his own herbs. He shows up to, we gather at 3:30, 3:40 every day to pre-record the billboards and anything that needs pre-taping. And it's the moment of the day when you get to chat with your co-host for a second before you're live. And he's always showing up with some beautiful elixir of, all of the herbs that he's grown in his garden. And the fresh from his yoga workout, he's mastered handstands during the pandemic. I have done none of that, alas. On the other hand, I have kids at home and Ari does not. So that's my excuse, is that I'm conducting remote school behind those doors behind me.
That's a valid one.
Yep. I will say the one good thing I've done, and this may be common to a lot of people, is I used to have a 45-minute commute every morning. We'd roll out the door at 7:15. I would drop our kids at school, drop my husband at his office, and then carry on to NPR. And it was 45 minutes door to door. And now there's none of that. My kids are still not back at school. My husband is still working from home, as am I. And the early weeks of the pandemic, I was just showing up at my laptop 45 minutes early, which was productive. But I thought, you know what? Maybe I will run or walk in this time instead. And it is the one good habit I've picked up is every morning, rain or shine, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions this whole pandemic, I have gotten out the door and been outside. And I can't imagine giving it up now. I don't know how I used to do it. Just roll straight into the car and then straight into the office and then straight home and never go outside Monday to Friday, basically, unless I was in the field. So that's been a lifesaver.
You have a very good habit to show for it. See, that's great. I have a puppy to show for it myself.
Okay.
I got a pandemic puppy, a pug named Calliope, and she just turned 6 months old, and she's definitely been keeping a lot of my attention.
I have had a puppy, and I can imagine. That's great, though. Congratulations.
Do you have a favorite mistake, like a silly, memorable on-air stumble from your early days, that sort of thing? Like,
oh, gosh. So
here's mine.
And we don't have to go back to early days. I mean, there are things I do all the time, not all the time, but where you get the date wrong in the billboards at the top of the hour. It's whatever. What is today? Let's not get it wrong. Wednesday, April 7th. I will tell you it's Tuesday, and then we get all of these emails from people who are confused and furious. So I do things like that. I haven't thought about this in a while. I grew up in Georgia. I had more of a Southern accent than I do now. There was no deliberate attempt to use it, but I lived overseas and married a Brit and haven't lived in Georgia for years now. And so I say y'all, but a lot of my accent has been, I guess, beaten out of me. But when I first started at the BBC, I still had a noticeable Southern accent, at least to them. And I remember they sent me to Cambodia on a reporting trip to Angkor Wat, the famous complex of temples. It was a big solar eclipse, and I happened to be there for a different story. And they said, can you get from Phnom Penh up to Angkor Wat and cover this? And I said, absolutely, let's do it. And as I was filing down the line to BBC headquarters back in London, I remember I said my piece, and the producer gets on the phone and said, what did you just say? Say that again. And I said it again. And he said, did you just say you're at the ancient temples of Angkor Wat? And I said, yeah, the ancient temples. He said, ancient temples. Say it again. Ancient temples. And I had to practice for a while to make this palatable to the BBC global audience. But I finally got it. And to this day, when I have to say one of those words on air, it gives me a little giggle.
That's a good one. early days for me, very early on, before I even started at NPR, I was anchoring weekends at a commercial radio station, and I had a rip and read from the Associated Press that I was reading during a newscast, and it was a story about how a United Airlines flight had to be diverted because someone in first class had been behaving badly, including urinating in the aisle.
It's behaving badly.
Yes, it's behaving very badly. And the words urinated and united were very close together in sound, in syllables, and on the page. And I accidentally said urinated airlines. I thought I got away with it, too. I held it together until the end of the newscast, and then I sort of crawled under the desk. And I thought, oh gosh, well, my boss hasn't texted me, so I'm okay. And then my boss texts me and said, I'm laughing so hard I had to pull my truck over. So, he was a good sport about it.
It happened. It happened. And the rip and read, you see one thing and you're thinking another, and it comes out, or
words just come out that are not the right ones.
Sometimes you're focused so hard on like the difficult journalism you're about to do that you're just reading the copy that's put in front of you. I remember I was filling in on Morning Edition with Renee Montaigne when she hosted Morning, and she had the script in front of her that said, and I'm David Green, and she said it. And there's this pause because it's really hard to recover your credibility if you've just like gotten your own name wrong. The brilliant thing was she was introducing Scott Horsley, and Scott, there was this long pause, and then he said, "Well, I guess that makes me Don Gagne." She came out like, "Okay, we're scrubbing that from the transcript. It's gone. I'm going to go have a large vodka and set the day." As Renee Montaigne.
5 a.m. vodka, it's fine. Everything's fine. Another question from Timothy Click. What's the one thing you hope to do when things become normal?
Oh gosh, roam the world again. That's such an easy one. Thank you for the question. I am ready to never do another Zoom call again, with no offense to this lovely audience, but I'm so ready to engage in person and be out in the field. We've gotten to do a little bit of that. It's impossible to cover the news and just never go anywhere. So I've done a couple of reporting trips to Atlanta to cover the protests over the summer. We went to talk to voters in Pennsylvania in the run-up to the election. We went back and anchored from Georgia for the Senate runoff. That was interesting because it meant that I was, the election was the Tuesday and then the Capitol insurrection was the Wednesday. And we didn't know that there was going to be an insurrection. And it seemed like the biggest political story in the world was what was going to happen with the Georgia Senate runoff races. And we didn't have a poll on the Ossoff race. And so I'm anchoring the show from Atlanta as the Capitol is under siege, which was crazy. But we had a great reporting trip, went to Trump's last big rally in the North Georgia mountains and interviewed all kinds of people. And went to now Senator Warnock's church, Ebenezer Baptist, the day after his election was called as the first African-American U.S. Senator from Georgia, which is just a big deal.
Yeah.
State.
Sometimes that gets kind of glossed over, but that is a big deal.
It's a huge deal. And it was crazy that night as we were anchoring live coverage of the insurrection and they finally called the Ossoff race. It was almost a footnote. I think I was on air and said something like, we're having one of these, we interrupt this breaking news to bring you breaking news kind of days. Yeah. So I need to tell you that John Ossoff just won here in Georgia. And so control of the Senate has now flipped to Democrats. And meanwhile, back to what the hell is going on at the U.S. Capitol.
Yes. I believe I was running the board here for that. I think I heard you say that.
Oh.
Yeah, that was a a new one.
But yeah, I can't wait to get back out and talk to people and get overseas and see what we've been missing, what's been going on.
There are probably a lot of rich global stories that will be there for the telling.
Yeah.
And rich local stories too. I mean, there's been sort of degrees of tragedy and difficulty, but everyone has had an experience that they've never had before in the last year.
Yeah.
And being able to elevate those voices, I feel like is one of my duties.
Oh, and y'all have been doing amazing work. It's kept the national network going. Has been the work of people all over the country like you at our stations who are out and about in ways that we cannot be right now. You've saved us a million times, and I'm sure that there are rich local stories to uncover. There always are, and that's our work. But it amazes me how much you all have covered and gotten out there, and the news you've broken, and the people you've talked to, and the voices you've shared with the rest of the country. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sure that all of the member stations appreciate that, and we certainly do. One more question, and it's from Joy Bolden, and I like it very much. Do you have a dream interview?
This is a good question. I did, and I suppose still do. As you've gathered, I've covered the CIA for many years and have interviewed just about every CIA director who's been on the scene in the years that I've covered it, until Gina Haspel, who was Trump's CIA director, who to this day has never given an interview to a journalist. And that...
Wow.
Yeah, never. She has maybe twice, I don't want to misspeak. A very small number of times she has taken questions publicly from a non-journalist. I think she spoke at her alma mater college. She's done very rare congressional testimony that was public, but then that disappeared as the Trump presidency unfolded. She's never taken a question, not one, from a journalist. And that to me was like a red cape in front of a bull. I mean, she as this fascinating person in a fascinating job, the first woman to hold the job, was a career CIA spy, who only had her cover lifted to take the number 2 position, the deputy job under Mike Pompeo, and then took over when he left. And I'm aware that for her, the calculation has to be, what could I possibly gain from this? I know you're going to ask tough questions. Why on earth would I sign up for this? Particularly as CIA director, she has less of a public obligation to do so than, say, the Secretary of State.
Yes.
Zero public obligation to do so. However, her predecessors all did. And I tried every which way to make the case that, look, she's going to have to speak at some point, she should talk to NPR, which will give her the time and space and to do a really, rigorous, but thorough, thoughtful interview where she gets to explain her thinking at length. And she never said yes. And now she's out, and she still hasn't given an interview, and I don't know if she ever will. So I would say that was the prize I was going for a while. And I don't know where I'll be next. There's a million people I'd love to talk to, famous, not famous, in positions of power, not at all in positions of power. It changes every day. I try to wake up and kind of before our 9:30 meeting, look at our big rundown of what's starting to come together for the day and think, is that really, we can do anything in the world. We can lead with anything, any local story, national story, international. Is that our best shot at this today? And if so, if that is clearly the urgent story, is that the most interesting person? Like, what do I actually want to know? And I take it backward from there. What do I actually want to know, and who might be able to answer that? Okay, let's find them. Let's get them on the air. So it kind of, like, every day there's a new person in my sights who I'm thinking, let's get them. How do we get them? Let's get them.
I love that answer. Everyone has a story to tell. Famous, not famous,
Sure.
world leader, not world leader. And that's what I find makes NPR so rich. And as you said, the time to explain oneself and the circumstances as opposed to sound bitey, short questions that often dominate news magazines elsewhere.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, that's us out of time and up against the clock. As we normally are on All Things Considered, I'm not as good at hitting my post right now because we've gone a little bit over, but I really enjoyed our conversation. Before we wrap up, I want to say special thanks to tech director and digital guru Ryan Ellison, producer and superhero Christine Hetzel, master of editorial support Matthew Petty, booking genius emeritus Jenny Babcock, and president and CEO Erica Pulley Hayes. And extra special thanks to Mary Louise Kelly for joining us this evening. Thank you so much.
It was my total pleasure. Thank you for making it so fun. It was really a pleasure. And thank you to everybody at WMFE. I want to second your thanks. And thanks to everybody who tuned in, who's still showing up for Zoom talk. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for excellent questions.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you.
You too. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.